Anyway, welcome everybody to the first iteration, first WarClub, one of four, and it's through the Tulsa Artist Fellowship and Arts Integration. Yeah. And so it's the first one, so we're working through it all and talking with everyone, and it's new, so we're learning how to work with this discussion that we're going to be bringing forward to you and to Tulsa as well. And of course, we want to do it proper and right way. We will have a land acknowledgement, and we do want to start with the prayer, so we're going to ask Casey to do that for us right now.
Latia, Yishiziwitike, Bank Abdi, Mashte Bank, Oklahoma. Wahe Tamashite, Tinike. Wakanda Khube, Maja Khube. Wiblaha Ehe. Wiblaha Ni. Wiblaha Mi, Miamba. Dachte Te. Ish Agi Waujinga. Shinga. Wakanda, we thank you for everything that is the sacred sun, the sacred earth, the elders, the men and the women, the babies, the unborns, the forelegs, the fins, the wings, the sacred water itself. As she has blessed us this day with life, all these things have. We want to just gather ourselves together with one thought, one way forward, one spirit, one intention, and that is to uplift the teachings of our ancestors and to make a way forward for the 7 generations to come. All those thoughts in between for the sickly, for the ones that we're missing at home, for the travel mercies, we're going to give to you at this time for you to use as needed and to put where it belongs. Thunder Nation, thank you for coming through day before yesterday and letting us listen to your voice and understand the powers that are true and real. Give us the ability to take all of these things in and bless this event as it is the first of its 4 kinds, as our people look at things in terms of 4 many times. And allow us the honor to join together and to raise up the names of those who have taught us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As I was saying, it's the first of 4, and this is through the Tulsa Artist Fellowship and a collaboration with my mother, Anita Fields, and I. And she has, in collaboration, we thought how to work this conversation, and we come up with that she will be doing the first 2 facilitations of the panels and deciding who's going to be speaking, the panelists and so forth, and then I'll be doing the latter 2 later in the year, coming in the fall. And it's going to kind of be almost like a timeline of Oklahoma, indigenous activism here in Oklahoma, with it culminating to the in conversation of current and younger contemporary activists, not saying that this isn't contemporary now, but that the younger activists that are practicing their dialogue and efforts in Oklahoma and how it corresponds to the individuals that were around in the 70s that started this conversation here in Oklahoma when it was needed and necessary and still is. It will culminate into an exhibition in the spring of 2022 here in Tulsa. I'll be taking portraits of each individual where we took them today, and it will be a photo exhibition show, but it'll also be a documentation of and catalog of the information that is being spoken to, because there's a lack of it and a lost story, which is what we're trying to bring out today in this conversation, a very needed dialogue, to find solutions for you all to hear it, the real story of Oklahoma, the real story of the politics of where we stand and what the state is about. and the individuals that are from here and have been burdened to be here by some of the state sanctions. So I appreciate you all coming here and making time to listen to us, listen to these beautiful speakers and the stories, as you'll see. And I'll be coming in the latter two conversations later in the year, but I just wanted to introduce myself as being a part of this collaboration, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, and thank you all. So with that, I'll pass it to my mom to speak and do an acknowledgement, and then we'll pass it down for bios and so forth.
Thank you. I want to begin with the land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. Some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted, and some fled Tulsa, never to return. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge that this is what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the tribal lands of the Osage, Cherokee, and Muskogee people. We honor their elders, past and present. We are standing on the land of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. We pay respect to these victims and survivors, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement upon this land. Tulsa Artist Fellowship offers our care and commitment to acknowledging these truths and resisting injustice in all forms through intentional programming and artistic practices. And just a little bit more about WarClub. WarClub is a symbol of resistance, and it stands as a metaphor for activism. It occupies a space in the political landscape of present-day America. Our Native activism is a direct result of the failed United States policies of relocation, assimilation, land termination, and extermination. We recognize those who fearlessly stood up and spoke out for reform, like Philip Deere, Muskogee spiritual leader and human rights activist from the Neaka ceremonial grounds, and Clyde Warrior, Ponca, the powerful intellectual whose genius coined the phrase Red Power. We see their images behind us. And building on the work of the ancestors, Native activism evolves into the actions and visions of today. It is capable, creative, and determined individuals like our guest here tonight, whose Red Power roots run deep in Oklahoma. They make change, kick open doors, and inspire reform. WarClub seeks to share the stories of leaders, grassroots activists, and those who have made significant contributions to the social justice landscape and the role that art has played in their endeavors. And most of all, we hope that WarClub seeks to inspire and instill pride in hopes to activate individual efforts to create change for the betterment of their own communities. And so tonight we have Ben Barnes with us, who is going to serve as our moderator. Ben currently serves as the chief of the Shawnee tribe. Prior to becoming chief, he worked as a Shawnee language volunteer alongside his brother in hopes to revive the Shawnee language. Upon taking office with only a small number of fluent Shawnee speakers remaining, Chief Barnes declared a state of emergency for the Shawnee language, as well as declaring the years 2021 to 2030 the decade of the Shawnee language. Ben is also a member of his people's stomp ground at White Oak. It is from this frame of reference that he hopes to guide the Shawnee tribe's future, recognizing the importance of our traditions to inform the crafting of tribal policy and law. Perhaps more germane to tonight's WarClub discussions is how Chief Barnes has looked to other traditional communities in eastern Oklahoma and learned from their examples of shared experiences between those communities to inform his own tribal government. And I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Attica. I'm truly the one's honored to be here. With my family's roots deep in Quapaw, Oklahoma, and my traditional background at White Oak with our Shawnees there, I've long heard stories of Oklahoma's Red Power emergence and the legacy that Oklahoma indigenous activists led to successes in inherent human rights, such as Philip Steer's work, which led to the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other sacred protections such as our Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is human rights for our ancestors. So I'm truly honored to be sitting here today with two individuals who are the epitome of that work. So if you would join me in welcoming Casey Camp Hornick and Richard Ray Whitman. Casey Camp Hornick is the Pumpkin Nation's environmental ambassador. She's also a former councilwoman and the hereditary drum keeper of the Women's Scalp Dance Society for the Pumpkin Nation of Oklahoma. And she's a longtime activist, environmentalist, actress, and published author. First taking up the cause of the Native and human rights in the early 70s, it has been this last 15 years that she has began her plea for environmental justice for her Ponca people and for people around the globe. Calling it the Toxic Tour, Casey has diligently worked to remediate and bring attention to a corridor of toxic environmental industry surrounding the historic lands of Ponca people. Because of Casey's work, the Ponca Nation is the first tribe in the state of Oklahoma to adopt the Rights of Nature statute and the first to pass a moratorium on fracking on tribal lands. Casey was also instrumental in the drafting and adoption of the first ever International Women's Treaty protecting the rights of nature. Casey travels the globe bringing awareness and speaking multiple times at the United Nations Forum on Indigenous Issues. She is also a board member of We Can and Movement Rights and continues to lend her support to grassroots environmental organizations and budding activists around the world. So join me again in welcoming Casey to tonight's discussion. Also helped me to welcome Richard Ray Whitman tonight, a Yuchi and citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Richard is an artist, actor, and activist. He spent his lifetime working to strengthen Native communities through his creative efforts, his art, his photography, and has been exhibited at museums and galleries nationally and internationally. Whitman's work has been featured in magazines and books, including Strong Hearts and Oxford University's textbooks on Native North American art. He attended the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the California Institute of Arts. As an actor, he has performed in critically acclaimed films, including Barking Water, Winter in the Blood, Drunktown's Finest, and Neither Wolf Nor Dog. He appeared in series for AMC Television and Netflix, and will be appearing in Story One Harjo and Taika Waititi's upcoming FX comedy series, Reservation Dogs. Richard's involvement with activism began with his opposition to the Vietnam War and support for the civil rights and treaty rights as a student at IAIA in 1968. He participated in the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. At the community level, Richard has worked with the Oklahoma Arts Council, the Native American Arts Students Association, to teach young people how art can bring them closer to their cultural heritage and help with the intergenerational trauma that so many Indian youth experience. In recent years, Richard has worked with Idle No More, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and other groups to oppose oil pipeline developments that threaten cultural resources and water supplies. Join me in welcoming Richard.
Fase, Yujiha Akeno, Kakal is the way. Hyondale Koen, no Akeno. Greet you in many first languages of this country. And, welcome, and I look forward to sharing.
Also want to thank all of you for attending tonight's beautiful evening, and also those of you attending virtually. So the first, tonight, if we could all consider this an informal conversation, I hope that you can all think of this as being able to attend a dinner party, or perhaps, or we're sitting around the table or the campfire together having these conversations. So at the end, we'll ask for some questions. So perhaps Casey, Well, Richard, what was the importance, in your opinion, of early Oklahoma activists and thinkers like Philip Deere and Clyde Warrior?
Well, my introduction to Clyde Warrior, I think I was in the 9th or 10th grade, 66, 67, and a teacher gave me a copy of a little handout, National Indian Youth Council, ABC, Americans Before Columbus, and there was a short piece for Clyde Warrior. We profiled 7 or 8 people from his community and at large. And I read that profile, his profiles, and I guess I was like most of those profiles he was sharing. But it was, for me, it impacted me. And he lived a short time, even after I read that particular pamphlet. A couple of years later, he had passed away. But he, his sense, like you said, Anita says, you know, he coined this phrase, Red Power. And it was at a time when, early, his ideological and his way of thinking, his fresh way of, fresh approach to redefining Indian Reorganization Act, all the politics with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, counterproductive to us. And he based it on his Ponca cultural teachings to base this new movement on. And he was at odds with his own tribal members at times, tribal council. He was at odds with Indian people and politicians of the day. But he was steadfast, so he was an inspiration to me without even meeting him in first person. And I've read his early material further on. And as a student in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1968, 69, there was a NCI conference, National Congress of American Indians, one of the oldest lobbyist groups for representing Native Americans. And National Indian Youth Council came there, and United Native Americans from across the West Coast, Berkeley, Los Angeles. And it was my first protest. And they were trying to seat a former governor of Alaska, Walter Hickel, as the head of the Department of Interior. It was very anti-Indian, very anti-environment. And so that was my first demonstration to act in first person. We had gone there with the Indian Club to perform for the audience. So we got kicked out of the Indian Club. So that was my first introduction to, this is not the Indian ways, as our sponsor said. And then Philip Deere came later for me. But my first inspiration, I think it was the way I began. I was raised by my grandmother, who didn't read or write in English. My first teacher, and now I know probably my best teacher, who gave me another perspective, how to look at the world, how to view the world. So that would be my first inspiration, I could say. And she didn't speak the English language, and so the Yuchi language was the language of the household. We lived in a little small rural community called Gypsy, Oklahoma, and at times I thought it was a perfect isolation, but I certainly got sensitized as I got older. And but is my time up? Okay.
Sure it is.
All right.
So Casey, tell us about, if you can tell us about Clyde Warrior. If we could hear about your reflections on Clyde Warrior. Casey.
Oh, didn't know the guy. He was Ponca. And we're real proud of the fact that the National Indian Youth Council happened. My inspiration, very much like Richard's, was my mama and my brother Carter Camp. But my mama, the stories that we heard about when we were young were those of pure resistance from the beginning. My mother's father was on the forced removal from Nebadaska, and he was walked down here at the age of 4 or 5 years old, along with my great-grandparents. And we talked from the time we were very young within our home about the fact of the Allotment Act and what it did to us, and the fact that my great-grandfather, old man McDonald, my niece right there recognizes all of these names, was the last war chief of the Poncas. So we were raised in a resistance within this little tiny confines of our home. Meanwhile, trying to live, I know I went through 12 different schools. The colonized process was being pounded in us, and at the same time we heard the stories of resistance at home. And I remember, my mom talking about being kidnapped at the age of 6. She'd been hidden out in the Osage Hills because her older brothers and sisters had been kidnapped by the officers and taken to Cantonment, Oklahoma, 200 miles away. And she had been kidnapped out of what is now called our powwow grounds, our celebration grounds, where they had brought her out of hiding. And she was in the camp down there, and they were eating together, and the touring car came through with those people in it, those mean, ugly people. And they grabbed up 4 of our children at that time. One of them, Stanford White Star, was 3 years old, but he was big, and they thought he should be in school. So I remember the stories of Mama talking about how the 3 cousins would go into the boy's dorm and sneak him out and bring him in at nighttime to comfort him and care for him during the night. And then before daybreak, they'd have to get him back over there. I remember about going to, Old Gravy. Yeah, in Pawnee, one of the many places she was forced to, and her older brothers were taken to Carlisle. And I remember that she was 15 when she broke the bonds of all of that. She was sitting like this because they had to in the boarding schools at Chilocco. And when the woman was talking about history, the history teacher was, my mom made a small gesture like that, just a nod of her head like, no, that didn't happen. And the history teacher walked directly to her and with her big history book just smacked her on top of her knuckles like that with that history book for making that small gesture. So my mom, who stretched to hit 5 foot, stood up and picked up the same book and just slammed the woman upside the head and knocked her flat. And left the school and didn't go back. And those were the stories that encouraged me to understand that I didn't have to agree with them. I didn't have to incorporate into my heart the things that they were pounding into my brain. And then when my husband and I had our first daughter, she was born in 1970, none of that had ever fit me. It was like going into the square rooms and always knowing. I got saved 7 times, by the way, because I kept trying to fit into the Christian church too. Every time I'd move and they'd have Bible studies and, a lot of Native kids, I don't know about the rest of you, but I really loved the fact that they had cold Kool-Aid and good cookies, and those summer programs. So I'd go to those and I'd get saved so they'd leave me alone. And then hang out with all the other children and everything, but it never fit. And when we had our first child, Brother Carter, somehow, I don't know, I guess he thought my husband and I couldn't possibly understand how to take care of a child. So when Julie was born, he just came up and just occupied a room in our house, and he was writing this very angry poetry. Of course, he knew Clyde well. And I loved it. It was like, oh goodness, so this is where I place that stuff inside me that really it didn't have a place at that time. When I was hearing you saying Indians, we're not Indians anymore, you know. We come here as a Yuchi and a Ponca and a Shawnee and a Wajaji. And at that time, we were just Indians, you know. And it didn't fit, it never fit. But that was just the series of misnomers that they constantly piled on us in order to try to make us fit into this melting pot. And that's what it was called, right? When we were young. You're supposed to assimilate. You're supposed to forget who you are. You're supposed to forget the history while we are crushing you and taking everything that you have. We're supposed to somehow deal with that. So Brothers' poetry for me brought home all of those, all of the angst inside me. And I know my son Jeff is trying to pretend that he's not really my son back there. That kind of inspiration that we had in our homes, I think, or when you were reading all of the little bio stuff, my real bio reads mama, grandma, great-grandmother, sister, auntie, daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, survivor of the Holocaust of our people. And we were taught within our home structure how to be that. And so when AIM came along then, that jumps into the 1970s, American Indian Movement. Now I think we should call it Aboriginal Indigenous Movement, but you know, it's a different time. At that time that fit us as well. It felt like, oh yeah, I am so ready to take to the streets, you know. And we had such fun taking over buildings, you know. It was so empowering. It's still one of my favorite things to do, except everybody's so well armed these days, it's a little more frightening. I remember Jeff keeps dodging back behind everybody, but remember at Standing Rock, son, when all those Wanashis showed up there and they're inching towards us and all of that? Man, these guys, the police have just given them every kind of huge weapon from, you know, the military, that it's a little harder to go take over a building, although I've got some in mind. On this land back stuff. But Carter Camp went on to organize over 30 chapters of the American Indian Movement here in Oklahoma. And then there were people like Martha Grass, who was on the Poor People's March with Martin Luther King, and Nora Crazy Bear was with her. And then there are the nephews, Kim Grass and Viola Hatch and her sons, and the Pawnee boys, the real riders, that wore their long hairs to school. My sons were wearing long hair. And we ended up having to go all the way to the Supreme Court so that our young men could wear their long hair in school. It was a, you know, Red Power was an explosion of consciousness and reclaiming. So, yeah, I remember it all. I'm still inspired by it, but I know you can't tell that, so.
For those that are at home and may not have seen, but on the screen as we were preparing to have this, we had the words of Philip Deere were playing in the background. And someone coming up in, you know, my generation, hearing the words of Philip Deere, you know, is powerful. His presence even on videos is just magnetic. And the words that he had, these offers about his identity as a Muskogee person. It's rooted in that tradition of his people. And it should come as no surprise, I think, for, you know, us that know the legacy of orators like Logan, Tecumseh, and of course Philip Deere. Coming to know his children, Bon Deere, Nuyaka, and being in presence of the Philip Deere Roundhouse and seeing that this legacy still lives. I want to drill down a little deeper on the Philip Deere and that what that was like. He was one of these early Oklahoma activists, and here in eastern Oklahoma we have all these different tribes. And so what was it, the power and the magnetism of a guy like Philip Deere that was able to speak to so many different nations, no matter if they wasn't Creek, it could be Ponca or Shawnee or Quapaw or all these eastern Oklahoma tribes. What was it about Philip that drew people? What was that voice, his message? What was that?
He was a great orator for sure. I mean, he spoke bilingual. I mean, he was good at expression, and he hosted these youth and elder conferences back in the 70s, and he invited representatives, traditional leaders from the Six Nations, Canada, Dakotas came down in the Southwest, Northwest. They were so happy, the fishing rights, and so he didn't depend. He says, I don't think we can educate Indian educate our young people in public schools today. This is missing, and until they accept our identity, our culture, and the curriculum that we have to teach our young people. So he brought all these different groups of people, traditional people, and their viewpoints, and their culture, their traditional teachings, and I just remember it was like historian. We all have to be historians in some way, family historians, tribal historians, and your personal historian as well, your own history. He seemed to be able to build on that, but he was surrounded by, informed by a lot of viewpoints, cultural viewpoints too as well. And he was open to that, and I think the setting, in a rural setting where he lived very humbly, poverty level, if you will. But he built this traditional roundhouse to welcome all the visitors from other parts of the country. And I remember one particular teaching in the roundhouse, and they would fast, and once a big tarantula came off the rafters of the roundhouse and came onto the ground and started crawling toward the central fire. And so the whole of the audience sat in spellbound with this spider, this big tarantula going.
I apologize. Do you mind coming a little closer to the mic?
Okay, am I right there?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, sorry. But anyway, that was a teaching for the remainder of the day, this tarantula crawling toward the fire. It circled the fire and went up one of the posts, and there were 4 posts there. But anyway, there was great lessons in this. Each tribe had their own personal stories or references to the spider in their culture, in their teachings, and even some trickster qualities to the spider as well. And so, yeah, but Philip Deere, he would welcome a lot of us, even those of us in our crazy days, to come there, and if we want to get out of the cities, to stay there, and had ceremonies and sweat lodge, and if you wanted to dry out, get out of the cities, get out of the craziness. Many of us spend weeks there. I did, and so he led by example. I should say.
He did. He did. I think that to put some things in perspective, Richard was talking about this coming after Vietnam. It also was coming on the heels of the civil rights movement that had really ignited everyone's minds and spirits to a huge degree. And there was that portion of people like Martin Luther King that came from a place of pure spirituality. And Philip Deere, for me, did the same thing. And as that person that was just talking to you about how didn't feel like if I sat in a church, I really wanted to pray, but I'd find if I put my head down, I'd be checking out somebody's shoes and thinking, I wonder where they bought those, But when I was around Philip Deere and the people who were coming from a traditional spirituality, it was something that I felt deeply, that I connected with in a way that helped me to understand my place in the universe. And people like Brother Carter and Leonard and so many of my sons talk about going to the University of the Universe. And it felt as if when we were in the presence of people like that we were at the University of the Universe. We were actually learning the reasons that our people have a connection to this portion of Mother Earth, the reason that we have a connection to this place that they called Oklahoma, the home of the red man, even though, out of the 39 federally recognized tribes, I even hate to say that, we self-recognize. That's such a stupid thing to even have to say, but there are only 3 indigenous, like the Ponca, when I make my land acknowledgements. We're from Nebraska, or Nebraska. And so the place that we were forced to come to belonged to the Wichita people. And that's my land acknowledgement always, is that was where Wakanda, that's where the Great Spirit placed them. And Philip always came from that place. He came from that place of spirituality and understanding that even though as a displaced person, he was connecting himself to the earth there. And all of the spiritual leaders that he was speaking of that came there, came with that offering. This is how we relate to the earth. This is how we relate to Father Sky, Star Nation. This is how we relate to a place that is going to be where the unborn come to gift us with their presence,
Casey, you introduced yourself. You made this dismissal of your biography, went straight to who you really are. Because I think oftentimes we, as traditional people, we don't get hung up on these words. A lot of folks get hung up on activist or those type of words. And sometimes I don't like that word activism. Sometimes there's things you can't abide. It's like, I'm not going to abide this anymore. I can't be silent. I can't not speak up. So with Philip Deere, is like his words were, he wasn't speaking from a place of words or high levels of education or great philosophies, but these are just universal truths. So for you and Richard, what was your initial experiences and influences that led to your, I'm not abiding this anymore, I will stand, I will speak up? What were those moments?
Well, one of them is sitting in this room back there and keeps trying to make me ignore him. But that's my children. My children. When each of them were born, they received a colonized name, but they also received true names that identified them from who they really are as Ponca people, as people that came from the stars initially, and chose to be here in this sacred spot that other people call Earth. And I frankly did not want them to go through the same thing as I went through, where I had to wait until I was in my late teens, early 20s in order to become a complete person. I didn't want them to have to, and they did, they had to go to schools. It was really an unpleasant reality in our lives. Because once you get your mind bent to a certain place, it takes a lot of work to unbend, and to decolonize. And so it always seemed like the very least we could do for them is to offer them a knowledge of what is real and true, and that our ancient teachings that have an understanding with our place in the universe, to balance the nonsense that they had to learn in schools, you know, to be able to be part of it. I mean, I never wanted to be an actress at all because I thought it was pretty fluffy. But as an activist is a silly word, you know. What I'm doing is just being Ponca. I'm living true to the teachings that I was given as Pankawa'u, as a woman of the Ponca, that I have no other thing in life to do but the duty and honor to make a place for those that are coming after me, just like the ones before did. There is no decision about that. And if that means that you deal with the situations with giant corporations and call them out for what they're really doing. I'm feeling a little guilty, by the way, because I've got water sitting in plastic up here, which is a petroleum product. I hope it gets recycled. But there's a constant dichotomy in our lives like that we have to balance out. So as a mom, as a grandma, then my duty and honor is to say, well, you may have learned this in school. Maybe they're doing that land run thing in your school. So here's your Ponca dress and your moccasins, and you stand aside just like they made us do when they did that land run. They wouldn't let any people of color participate. Go ahead, let those white kids run and get dusty and, you know, portray the robbers and thieves that they were. Not trying to offend anybody, but it's true. And get some balance in the lessons that they have to learn. So for me, it's every day, all day. It's not a choice. It's a reality of telling truth and being part of a truth.
I like what you have to say about Jeffrey being your inspiration and just trying to be Ponca. I know there was a moment for me where it was me and my brother. We always thought that we'd have older people take care of our Shawnee ways, and we have to bring those people into our traditional community in a particular way, and they were all gone. And so it was language was the foundation of the activism for us. And then once we started unpacking that was that seminal moment. So for me, my awakening moment was the loss of language. And then it had gotten to a place that I thought maybe we have to do something. This is where I stand. This is the place in which I die on, is this spot, if we don't save it now. So for you, hearing you as Jeffrey, and from my perspective, and at least for my brother, was language. I'd like to hear Richard. Richard, what was that awakening experience for you, where you said, this is it, I have to get out, I can no longer abide this, I'm becoming active.
Well, I think, early I had a lot of unresolved grief, pain in the way I was raised, and my family was, I don't know, one half of my family tree, my father's side. But my mother and my uncles, they were all boarding school, taken away, and the whole breakup, our family cohesiveness, as you will. And somehow within our culture, there's no orphaned in a way. And so somehow our grandma managed to get custody of us. But I remember back then it was the welfare, and they were always trying to still get us again, and my older brother, and discrediting her as not being a good guardian because she couldn't read or write, and disqualify her. But somehow she manages to hold on to us, and but I think I began to realize that I certainly got sensitized as time went on, and what my mother and my uncles went through, and they echo that, saying, I talked to my uncle today from New Mexico, 93 years old. He says, I can never make that up, that time away from mother, even though they tried to bring us back. And so In some ways, that really inspired me because I went on a quest to try to find my father's side of the family, and I never managed to. So the time I arrived in Santa Fe, I met other like-minded native students from across Indian country, urban areas, reservations, all backgrounds, and we brought that with us there to that campus. But we also brought our talent and our visions. So we didn't come empty-handed, but we brought a lot of our burdens too. And that's when I began to see the possibility of art, and it's interesting to hear Casey say, Brother Carter, poetry, the creativity, you know, what you contain are counterproductive, you're not releasing it. And so then I began to realize too, more and more, you know, for better or worse, that's who I was, a Yuchi hike, a Yuchi person, better or worse. And of course, at that time, Santa Fe was sort of being a new school, Indian school, boarding school, where you embrace your culture instead of trying to remake you, to create from your culture, encouraged. It still wasn't the ideal model, but so there were all these possibilities I began to see, you know, and I think meeting like-minded other Native students and that pain and anger we had to channel it. We were looking for something. And we've seen all the civil rights movements on TV and the evening news, Students for Democratic Society. It was the 60s, the counterculture, music, bam, bam, drugs. It was all of that. But somehow it was a moment, a possibility for us. And then seeing Alcatraz in '69 on the evening news, you know, seeing visible Indian people was another jump start, you know, and so it was a series of things for me to bam, kick-started me or pushed me on, and most was about my own anger and self-anger and pain that I had was unresolved for.
I know that I appreciate the work that you two have brought to film. You're both creatives and actors, and whenever I have seen you two on film, you can tell that there's this knowledge of each other, that you're really friends, and there's this real relationship. And what I think is best about I want my kids to see on film, on TV about Native people, or my grandchildren, is just Indian people just being Indian people. They don't have to be a certain way. We don't have to be, you know, it's not performative in some way that people expect us to be. One of my favorite ones was this stupid sci-fi show, and Graham Greene was just the mayor of a town. He wasn't even Indian. He was just a mayor. That's all he was.
Yeah.
So for you both have had these lived experiences and reflecting upon, you know, this life's work. What were some of these major accomplishments that, you know, that when you look back, you say that was a fine moment. I'm glad I stood for this, or I'm glad I was present to witness.
I think the last victory there's a series of victories, and often our victories aren't spoken of, but the Keystone XL was stopped. And Jeff, I'm sorry to do this to you again. But one time we had this grand time. They'd called me to come to Washington, D.C. because we formed the Cowboy and Indian Alliance. We had actually done I'd gone up there to work in Nevadaska in South Dakota with Faith Spotted Eagle, who is Yankton. And we have worked at finding any way that we could to hold the federal government responsible for what they do. And I was there at the United Nations in 2007 when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People passed. That was pretty magnificent. But when I was called by Faith up into the area to stop KXL, it was well over 10 years ago. And she and I were trying to figure out how to utilize this treaty that was made in 1854 between the Yankton and the Ponca. Are there any Pawnees in here? Well, I'm sorry about this. But you should be proud of your ancestors because you guys were just raiding us both to the point, both tribes. I mean, every horse we got, you know, Pawnees in there raiding the horses, grabbing the corn, all the pretty women and strong men. No, not that bad. But the Yankton and the Ponca decided to ask the federal government to help us to utilize a treaty that we made ourselves, but we still had to have their okay. And it was so that there would be peace and those pesky Pawnees would just quit raiding us, you know. And we thought, well, what a good idea. We have never abrogated that. The Pawnees never abrogated that. And it is signed by the federal government. So how can they give the okay for KXL to come through our territory when this treaty is guaranteeing us the right to clean water and healthy earth? And it seemed like a good way for us to do. But we had this issue with white people living on our land up there. And they're all proud of themselves. Oh, 4 generations of my family have lived on Ponca. Well, and then they're crying around about eminent domain. Oh, really?
Well, you bring that up. I want to contrast that, because that's one of the things I'm really interested in. And if we could hold this slide right here, because I want to get back to this in just a minute. At the risk of being very political, compare and contrast what happened with the Bundys and what happened at Standing Rock, because the public perception of those two things seem to be completely different. The way that those are being talked about, you know, by politicians and the public, and the lack of understanding, and even in the way that it was handled by authorities.
I think it's a sterling example of how all things have been handled by the federal government. If it is in relationship to us, you know, like my relative here being the last man out of Wounded Knee in '73, who knows that history? Who knows how many of them had to starve and be imprisoned? And at the same time, Nixon was dealing with Watergate, and people up there got a slap on the wrist. So when you see what happened at Standing Rock, and you know, it's still traumatizing when many of us talk about the, you know, when you hear a helicopter go over and you immediately are reminded of they're about to kill us. You know, when you see the sprays coming from the planes and you realize that while these guys are at Standing Rock, there were constant gassing of us up there, you know. And the Bundys, in their whiteness, got all of this huge amount of press. You know, the Bundys always remind me of that comic bunch of family people that were, I can hardly say it without association, but anyway, they were treated in an entirely different manner and were looked at as martyrs. And looked at, and I felt sorry for them. You know, they had a loss of life as well. But there is no comparison with what goes on in indigenous lands every single day. Today at Line 3 up there with Enbridge, there's women who are trying to hold up a camp up there to stop a pipeline, just like at Standing Rock, when there was going to be 12 million people. Not very many of them indigenous, but 12 million people downstream affected by that pipeline. Who held the line? Indigenous people did. You know, and who held the line for the indigenous people? I'm still waiting, you know.
I want to segue to Richard for just a minute and ask him about his lived experience in those key critical moments that put your reflection of your involvement in activism, and when you reflect upon those truly sacred moments that you realize you're standing in.
Well, I would definitely say Wounded Knee in 1973. There's an image here of me looking through a scope, a surveyor's scope, a 1950s, 60s, early surveyor's scope. And it was a ceasefire day, and people were coming out of the bunkers and out of the shelters, and doing laundry, using a hand pump to wash their hair. No shampoo, but so I took my turn at the surveyor's scope, and there, looking directly at me, was a marksman, U.S. Marshal, with a long scope on his rifle. And he's looking. I never had that kind of eye to eye, back and forth. So I tried to call my friends over and share this image of this U.S. Marshal having me. And so the photographer who took the image, an independent journalist, always said, he's just letting you know that he has you in his mark. He could take you out anytime. And could have pulled the trigger on me right there. So that was a real turning point. But I remember they built the ceremonial lodge right there on the side where the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 happened, where they slaughtered women and children and elders. So the lodge is based right on top of the blood of the not 100 years old. And and their ceremonies that they shared with us and included myself. So I think just being on that, not to saying it's an important place, but it's a powerful place. And the poverty of the reservation at that time was, I don't like comparisons, but anything in the poverty South was there on that reservation year after year. But the culture was very rich, and that made me look back to Oklahoma, made me think maybe I could do something back home. But it gave me a short of calling, any time it could have been killed or murdered. Well, there was a spirituality there that Chief Crow Dog and Wallace Black Elk made sure or helped us be protected into. So made me have a real reassessment of my life. Not to say to be die in vain, or some cheap jukebox stabbing, killing, murder. To be right there on that ground. That's a very, very powerful place, the Wounded Knee Mass. And 5 or 6 years ago, we did a film called Neither Wolf Nor Dog, and a real minimal budget, real minimal crew, cast, and the lead actor was Mr. Bald Eagle, James Bald Eagle, and he was 95 years old. So they wanted to shoot some background scenes at this mass grave, and he says, I know how to go in there, and those are not just Oglalas buried here. These are Cheyenne River, Bigfoot. These are my grandma and grandpa's in here too, in this grave, mass grave. He says, I know how to go in there. This is not a movie backdrop. This is not a movie set. So he explained that in his language to the people in Pine Ridge, and explained it in English to non-speakers. And I always remember it. And he asked me to help him So he, in his language, he sang. So I always think about that place, sense of place, or our place. But it really made me reassess my own life, that not to waste my life for how I had been living earlier years.
If we could bring up that slide with Casey, with the other lady from the Amazon, so I want to segue to that for a minute, Casey. And if you could tell us about this, and then I want to follow up with a question. Here, tell us what's going on here.
International Day of the Women, probably about 5 years ago. Actually, I'd met Gloria. She's one of the lead women from a tribe in the Amazon. There are 7 tribes there that are fighting pipelines. And I was down in Ecuador with some friends learning about how Ecuadorians had built in rights of nature into their constitution, because I could see that it could be of value to us within our sovereignty. And Gloria was one of the people there, and we meet everywhere all the time. But on that particular day, I was a little bit chicken, as again, I talked to my kids and companion about going down there because there's big snakes in that place. They wanted me to come into the Amazon. So we kind of made a compromise, and you know, Ponkas don't live where there's anacondas. Those anacondas don't know me, and I won't take you in a buffalo herd when you come up, you know. So when we went down there, I went to the edge of the Amazon to a river and a gathering near the jungle, and just went in a little ways. The whole thing was just amazing to me because their medicine people still have such incredible strength, like the Phillip deers and crow dogs and all of them. And the women, for the very first time ever in their teachings, have understood that this particular time in the universe is time for a rebalancing of male and female energies. That because of what has happened with the colonization of Earth and the way that men have led that colonization, that there's been a suppression of female energy. And I'm sorry, Jeff, but Jeff brought up one time about the fact that they burned their witches at the stake when they first came here. And he pointed out to me, he said, that's their wise women. You know, it's their women who understand the medicine. And how is it that they're going to have the guidance that they need? Well, down there, these women are taking that step out of the jungle in forms of leadership. And we had been part of a guidance, is the only way I could say, to form the first women's treaty that's between the indigenous women of the Americas to protect our Mother Earth for the generations to come. And this treaty was made by Wakanda, by the Great Spirit, by Mother Earth, and then put into a written form. And the women of the Amazon came to the signing. And then we had a signing in the original place of the Lenape, and it turns out that's Central Park. Who knew? So we also had one there, you know. And Gloria and I, since that period of time, have worked hard on trying to keep the petroleum industry out of the Amazon, primarily from China. And our unification has become global. Many of us are working right now on the emerging Indigenous Council for the Global Alliance of the Rights of Nature, realizing and incorporating into our understanding that we're not protecting nature. You know, we're not like just water protectors, land defenders. We are nature protecting itself. And it's really important that all of us kind of get that. You know, we humans have this giant ego, right? That makes us feel as if we're really doing something. But if we want this young lady right here to have 6 generations beyond her, that she has the right to be able to give them good air to breathe, good water to drink, good earth to grow her corn on. And it's our honor and responsibility as nature herself, as part of all of that, to be able to make that way. So Gloria is that warrior woman that I love and respect.
I have a couple questions still, and we're getting a little short on time, and I want to save some time for questions from the audience, but I do want to dive down just a little bit deeper on this, on the role of women in activism, if I hazard that word. Because, you know, I think when indigenous, traditional people look upon the role of women in activism, we see women everywhere. You know, in the past, at Wounded Knee, you know, Gloria, yourself, but even to now today, you know, but for Shawnee people, we had a woman that was, history didn't even bother to write her name down. And this is the early 1800s. And she was, you know, advocating return to traditional ways. But we still see those type of women in our communities today, whether they're like Ashley McCrae, who ran for corporation commissioner in Oklahoma to, you know, stop the things that ought not happen in our with fracking and elsewhere. But I don't think society generally recognizes the role of that, the number of women that are activists and leaders in our nations. Could speak to that just a little bit before we get to our next question.
Look out here. Look out here right now. All you women, stand up. Stand up.
And I suppose for those that are watching from the internet, the room's like 3/4 women.
Yeah, this is who we are. I mean, we're the ones that the water speaks to, that the moon speaks to, that has the honor of carrying within our womb generations to come, who has been given the honor of understanding the rhythms that the moon gives to us. We're life givers. We are the, you know, during this time that my relative was in Wounded Knee with my brothers, it was my honor to be the one at home cooking the dinners and raising the children and washing the clothes and all of those things. I never felt as if I had anything more grand to do than that. To be that caretaker had always just filled me. And then I watched these guys when they would go in to take over the buildings, when they would literally kick the doors open and take in the elder women, Martha Grass, Viola Hatch. What's Frances Wise' mom's name? I can't think of her name right now, but so many of the others like that, that knew what was needed within their tribe and their village and their home and their schools, and they would express that out. Well, now I've grown into that. Now I'm in my 70s, and I have enough experience that as soon as you're ready to kick that door, you know, now my sons kick the doors down, and, you know, me and Joe Kay and niece Alice and, you know, so many of the others then walk in that door and say, within our homelands, these are what's wrong and this is what we need, and we're going to have that. We're in a position now where we're saying land back, land back. We know what is needed. We know to be able to say no to the petroleum industry, and sure enough, the rest of the world is now beginning to understand that fossil fuels are killing us. And corporations have personhood, so why don't we acknowledge the personhood of the river, the personhood of the trees that trade breath for breath with us? It's an exciting moment to be able to utilize our traditional knowledge and our inherent wisdom and inherent understanding of the universe and how it flows, and to put it into their language and say, we're sovereign and we will protect ourselves in this manner, and you will abide by that, and then we will protect you, our neighbors, as well.
So briefly, so it gets to some questions from the audience. Richard, what projects do you have currently that you'd like folks to know about?
Oh, currently I'm a full-time great-grandfather. No, I still paint, I paint for my own self-therapy mostly, instead of for the gallery, but occasionally I do the gallery. And some film work now, I kind of got some good lead-ins now for the elder roles, So
I'm looking forward to the next
grandfather
one.
roles. So,
I'm looking forward to the Sterwin Harjo, Taika
Oh, yeah.
Waititi one. That's going to be
Red
fantastic. Casey, tell us about your projects you're currently working on or have coming up.
Right now, we're trying to, I'm the new Indigenous chair of the Indigenous Council for the Global Alliance of the Rights of Nature, and trying to put together a whole global look at if Indigenous people recognize the rights of nature within their territory, how can we uphold that legally? And so working with a bunch of attorneys as well as Indigenous people, and putting together iron forums or intertribal rights of nature forums that I kind of want to follow with our Trail of Tears up Nishu Day or the Missouri River to some of the tribes that are there, and begin to put these little islands of protection in place, And then more importantly, I'm a great-grandmother, and I really want to put an emphasis on the great. That's what I try to teach them all the time anyway. I used to just be a grandmother, but now I'm a great-grandmother. And trying to also, niece Alice was talking to me a bit ago because she always has worked here in Tulsa with the Ty-Car and Kenneth with the, and then I know with the, what is that group that works as a commission? What is that called?
Greater Tulsa Area Indian Affairs Commission.
And she's been working with the situation with the massacre that happened over here, and trying to help uplift those voices as well. And at the same time, she's Cheyenne. And how many people died in that massacre out there where your people were?
More than the Murrah building.
More than the Murrah building, yeah. So we have many chances to have people of color begin to really, lift each other's voices up. I remember one of the times we were in California, and Brother Cart called and said, hey, got this thing going for a march here, are you guys coming? And we said, sure, yeah, of course. Well, it turns out we were marching with Cesar Chavez because we were migrant farm workers when we were young, as part of that removal process in the 50s and 60s when we were taking off reservations. We were, so there's every chance for us to connect all the dots and begin to do an entire shift of realigning natural law with human law.
I know that our traditional way is to let everybody speak as much as they want until they get everything said. Unfortunately, we can't do that tonight, but I do want to take some time to please take I do want to take some time to get a couple of questions, because I could spend all night talking to you two. This has been truly special for me to be present and hear these things from you, but I'm sure that they have some questions as well. Does anyone have, if you will stand up, state your first name and your question? Surely someone has a question. Yes?
Hi, Brenda Heights. I do have 4 kids, but surely really calls you to action. And, but I'm curious, I know I have ideas, but I'm curious what you think outside of nature, climate change, oil. What are the other factors and forces that are kind of the biggest threats to our sovereignty on this land?
Brenda Pipestem asks, beyond natural resources, climate, oil, what are going to be the next big challenges to sovereignty?
Sorry, Rich, but
No, no.
I'm going to jump on this one
Yes,
for a
yes,
change.
please,
Yeah,
save
for a
me.
change. Of course, water. Water is one of the main things that we're all going to have. That's a global thing going on right now. But here in Oklahoma, there's this One Oklahoma push. Are you all aware of One Oklahoma? It is probably the biggest threat to sovereignty that we have had. It is the governor of Oklahoma, Stitt, and they misspelled his name. Has put together a commission, a Native American commission. Why do they? Anyway, Harold Hamm is one of the lead people on that, who is, the godfather of fracking. And they want to, if you want to just simplify it down to its basis thing, they want it to be one Oklahoma, where there is nobody that isn't just a plain citizen of Oklahoma, everybody with equal rights, which means we do not have any sovereignty at all. And he's pushing that through Congress right now. And it is the biggest threat for 39 tribes here. And should it be pushed through Congress, that means that the other 500 nations here will also lose their status. It's huge.
Richard, is there anything that causes you heartburn when you think and look down the road towards the future?
No, definitely water. Just re-echo that. Water is life.
Do we have another question in the back? Yes, you on the left. Yeah, you, my left, not your left.
You didn't recognize
No,
it.
that's my plant. I planted
That's your
her
plant?
back there. It's my daughter.
So being a descendant of some of those up there, if you had a time machine and you could go back, what would be one thing you would do differently?
If you had a time machine and could go back, what would be one thing you would do differently? And I'll start with Richard, since you're relative.
No, that's too loaded. She's setting me up.
She's setting you up? Oh, she may be setting you up on purpose.
No, you go.
Time is none of my business, but such a cop out. What would I do different?
I'm waiting.
What would I do different? I think work toward more. I would say struggle. Any struggle is even behind this moment here. The more we continue to struggle, whatever the issues that you identify or feel you can work toward, that struggle keeps you from becoming cynical. Struggle gives you hope, and or you don't feel hopeless. You can get down and be pessimistic. I think as long as you keep struggling, there's always been a struggle. Our ancestors struggled for us, and all these generations have struggled for us. And if I had anything to do over again, that would be to be more early on to struggle. And besides my more collective hope with action, direct action.
For a guy that didn't want to answer, that was heavy.
For a turn that time?
Yeah.
Richard, the
I had more than
philosopher
this.
over here. Who was that, Cher? If I could, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just go with the traditional thing. In the Ponca language, there is no word for time, Benishi.
Yeah.
Sorry. I can't do it. I think if I were to say this one thing that really embarrassed me real bad, I would not have done that. Brother Carter had all of the Lakota chiefs come to our camp late at night, probably in the early 70s, late 70s. And, you know, you never get all 7 chiefs together, much less in your little camp. And we hardly had any food anyway. But so me and my sisters-in-law get up and we go out and we wrestle up everything that we can so we can feed people. And the last thing we do is serve the coffee, you know, and walk around with the coffee and the sugar and whatever like that. And I got back over under the one lantern in our, you know, we were poor in those days. Still are actually. Anyway, we got back over the one light in our camp, and I realized that the can of sugar that I had just passed to the 7 chiefs and their wives was really old fry bread grease. I wouldn't do that, Benish.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, you in front.
Tom.
My name is Apollonia, and I know you undergrad, but I guess the question I have is something I've been thinking about a lot. I do think about a lot because I've been very involved. I come from a native Chicano activist family. And so if you two had any comments about strategy, right? Effective and not so effective strategies. So I'm thinking of the Red Power movement of the 1960s, of the 1970s, and strategies that activists used then compared to strategies brown indigenous activists use today. Similarities, dissimilarities.
So the question is to compare, contrast effective and non-effective strategies by red and brown activists from the 60s and 70s to those that may be used by activists today.
If I'm being honest here, I think too I'm coming from a place where I've been out to the Philip Dare Roundhouse. There's an international Indigenous Treaty Council out there, and we were all around a fire, a lot of Indigenous people from all over the world, and I don't know, I have this weird nostalgia for wanting that rather than Instagram memes about activism.
That was exactly where I was thinking about, and I'm not sure how to express it because I look at the internet and the web, and I think of web of life. I think that communication is important, but during this time that we were young, and we talked about Philip Deere, and he was talking about how he stayed out there for weeks at a time. All of these organizing things that we did, we didn't have phones, cell phones, we didn't have the internet. And so our times together were times together. When we talk about having that AIM house in Stillwater, even before Jeff was born, people came and camped out on our lawn and all around us for sometimes months. And we had all of that time to really know each other and to begin to strategize about things. So I think that we have that dichotomy where we need that, and that's why Standing Rock was so valuable. People got to know each other. But then during this time of pandemic, when we were being much kinder to Mother Earth by staying home, we learned to Zoom, you know. But as far as what strategies work and what don't work, I think that one thing I would know that kind of bugs me on a personal, I want everybody to warrior up. I want everybody to warrior up and do what is necessary and quit waiting for somebody else to do it. And I want people to quit being, I'm so traumatized, I'm so, you know, all these things affected me so heavy, I need a retreat. Oh, God. You know? That.
Well, yeah, obviously, like Casey says, that time, you know, we had a lot of misguided strategies too, you know, and we made mistakes, and it was a guerrilla theater, confrontational politics, you know, and those have their limitations too, you know, but they also have their moments and possibilities. But today you couldn't carry that out, you know, so much. But from that time, but so we learned from it. But even with all our mistakes, you know, and our human personal men egos, personality differences, there was always still, it was a time of hope. I mean, idealism. It was a time of hope. And it was a chance to reassess ourselves as Indian people, as tribal people, I should say. Not Indian people, but to reassess ourselves and each other. And so, a lot of misguided strategies for sure, and a lot of mistakes. But to counterbalance that it was also a time of hope and energy, possibilities.
Richard, Casey?
How does she see it? What do you see as the drawback and
I like how I'm getting dragged into this when I have so something I was reading earlier by a Black feminist activist, and she was talking about the call-out culture, right, and how kind of the left will, it seems like anymore, the left will eat its young for any type of mistake, misspoken word, and how immediately on the social media we're so quick to, oh, you're not doing this right, you know, your activism is wrong, you're canceled, you're not going to be found anywhere. Whereas I think that people, the government, COINTELPRO, whoever, is just laughing at the infighting over these nitpicky things. And also it's so easy to drag somebody and call out, check your mutuals on the internet, whereas we're missing being around these fires, seeing each other in person and seeing the humanity in each other, which is what I miss so much from when I was at the Philadelphia Roundhouse. I see some of these younger activists, they don't understand that life because they have lost that culture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Tom Fields, did he get his hand?
Tom, do you have a question in the back? No?
Just scratching, all right. All right. Come forward.
You know, this young woman is making me think too, because I was talking, and we have talked about women power a lot, but I really want to, you know, earlier I asked these women to stand up because we talked about that, but I'd like to see the men stand up, because so often we hear a great deal about what men are doing wrong, you know, and that we're not holding them accountable for this or that. I see nothing but warrior power here, you know, tonight. And they talk about misogyny, and there's this thing called misandry that is the same and the opposite thing that we women have to be very careful of with this call-out culture, this that you talked about. So please allow us to honor you. Please stand.
Richard, Casey, thank you tonight for your openness, being here present with you, feeling what you've had to share. I really appreciate being here. It's truly my honor. And Anita, it's been a true privilege.
Thank you, Anita, for all you do for all of us.
Thank you, Yadika.
Okay, with that, so this was a very powerful conversation, just like I knew it would be. Just, you know, put these folks together. I've known them for quite, for a long time, from that time back that we're talking about. So I want to thank a lot of people who make this happen. It takes many hands, to be able to do something like this. And I want to thank the Tulsa Artist Fellowship for their generous support. to our assistant, to Haley, who really helped out and did all the graphics and everything for our sign, for our program tonight. Nathan Young for the sound. Patrick of the Tulsa Past, and Patty Nichols brought us flowers this evening. And Brenda Pipestem and her daughter Matea provided nutrition for us. They nourished us with food. Julie O'Keefe brought those great cookies, our commodity cookies.
I love
you
these.
know. And I was kind of joking around. I kept saying, "Do we need commodity cookies for our event?" And everybody's like, "Yeah," you know. So, and of course, our wonderful guest tonight, Richard Ray Whitman, Casey Camp, and our moderator Ben Barnes. And
Thank
to
you,
all
Ben.
of you activists out there in the audience, and out there in the audience that is watching us online, I say thank you to you for all of your efforts and everything that you do. And so I think Yadika wants to do one thing. Did you want to do something?
Yeah, so originally the WarClub, I came with a project about 3-4 years ago maybe, where I made WarClubs, wooden WarClubs, more contemporary in color and adorned with more kind of like studded spikes, punk spikes. But they were kind of about talking about what the WarClubs were to Plains tribes in the 1800s and 1700s, and they imitated the gun stock, the rifle gun stock barrel WarClubs, and what we as warriors used and what they represented to our people and communities at that time. And we still do carry them in ceremonies, not everyone, some individuals, and also you see them at powwows as well. The ones I made were meant to be hung in offices, in homes, in schools, wherever it is that you're working, but to also remember that there's still a fight to be had, to carry with you who you are in your culture, to stay strong for your community, but also to stay strong for yourself, because the younger generations need that, and it's kind of thus the reason why we're here having this WarClub conversation. It stems from that project, and then also a conversation that me and my mother had, where we thought it'd be cool to have an actual club called the WarClub. So it all kind of stems from that project, and then furthering our thoughts of who we are as a family and community, from my mom and my dad and his activism, and knowing Richard and Casey and so forth. It's one big community of sharing and fighting and surviving, because as Indigenous people, we are survivors, and we are fighters, and we're activists for just being alive, for being Indian. So I wanted to gift you all with your own WarClub for your activism that I made. So Casey, you're in your WarClub to fight what you need to fight with. Count through.
So with that,
They're in trouble now. Whoever they are.
thank you for coming tonight. It really makes me feel good to see so many people in attendance.
Who's next and when?
We're coming up session. Our moderator will be Jim Gray, and our guest will be Suzanne Harjo, and we're still working on the date for that. So now that we're rolling, I think things will be a little bit easier, to start scheduling.
We'll be here. Yeah, thank you.